Anyways, what I'd like to do is to look at Hegel and his relationship to history and the way he uses history, and to make a few statements about the relationship between history and philosophy in his method. I'm mainly going to talk about just one of his texts, which is the one I think you all read on history. And within his history of philosophy discussion, I'm principally looking at his introduction, his long 120-page introduction. A lot of people have told me over the years that, why is it that I always give you this to read rather than, sort of its philosophy of right or phenomenology. And the reason for that is because although it's very simple relative to his other contributions, it's also very rich. And if you, particularly those of you that are historians or studying history, you will find that when you dip into the material, you do get surprised by some of his, even by some of his throwaway insights. And even this time when I read it, I haven't looked at it for a very, very long time. I just know I was reading a lot. I'm reading it, and then he makes this throwaway remark about Thersites from Homer, sort of in a way that is really, sort of incredibly focused, and you realize just how much work he's done over the years, and how his philosophy is saturated, thoroughly saturated with his history. And indeed, you can argue that for Hegel, history serves as a philosophical category. It is a philosophical category that he engages with it. And in the beginning of his lecture course, he begins by declaring that the subject is philosophical world history. That's what he calls it, philosophical world history. And as you'll recall, he then goes on and makes a distinction. It's got a real historiographer's touch. He makes a distinction between his philosophy and what he calls other kinds of philosophy. And particularly, it makes a distinction between what he calls original history and reflective history. The hallmark of original history for Hegel, as practiced by people like Herodotus or Thucydides or Julius Caesar, is that it kind of captures the spirit of the writer and the spirit of the action, which are related and they're one and the same, and it's kind of written almost contemporaneously. And even if it's not entirely contemporaneous, it is something that kind of captures the spirit within the historical writing itself. Whereas reflective history is a more of a ambiguous kind of category. And you'll remember he's got several kinds of reflective histories that he kind of talks about. And what he's mainly getting at in terms of reflective history, and what he's really critical of, is the after-the-event historian who kind of comes along, sort of decades or centuries later, and they're kind of using history as a way of almost rediscovering themselves in the past, and that's something that is quite critical of. He does talk about one subsection of reflective history, which is what he calls critical history, which is what today is unfortunately practiced in English schools, Scottish schools as well, from what I can tell, which is, when you go to learn history, you don't learn about history, you learn about skills. Sort of it's the history of history, which is okay if you've done 30 years of in-depth historical investigation, but they believe that somehow at the age of 9 you're going to be having profound historical skills with just play acting. It's like you might as well get 9-year-olds to pretend they're Napoleon or Julius Caesar and sort of play the kind of roles. It's a little bit kind of critical of that. His philosophy of history, because he's kind of talking about these other kinds of philosophies in order to highlight what is his own philosophical approach. It's the philosophy of history, and the way he kind of talks about it. Occasionally I'm going to slip into the word define, and that's very un-Hegelian to kind of define anything, because the minute you define it, you take it out of its context. So if I slip into it, please go boo, don't actually say that. But basically, what he means by his philosophy of history is that it means nothing but the thoughtful consideration of it, by which he means it's a kind of a priori from history. He's quite honest about it. A lot of historians use an a priori method, kind of pretend that it isn't. But in his case, he's quite upfront about it. And he basically says that philosophy is a process which is diametrically opposed to historiography. I think that's a very interesting discussion. I find that if you want to really kind of begin to grapple with the problem of method within history, this bit of the discussion is really quite useful, because he's basically saying that, and he's actually throwing it in your face, that he begins with philosophy, at least logically begins with philosophy before he looks at history. And he says that it's only thought which philosophy brings with it to the contemplation of history, which is the simple conception of reason, that reason is the sovereign of the world, that the history of the world therefore presents us with a rational process. He uses the word simple, but isn't that simple, which is why to make the discussion a little bit perhaps easier than it would be otherwise, I'm going to approach it as a historian rather than as a philosopher. Now, I would call Hegel to be one of the finest examples, Hegel's history, one of the finest examples of what we call a logical historical method. And a logical historical method is one that consciously privileges the logical and the philosophical, which kind of presupposes the history that he presents us with. So there's a kind of logically prior set of categories that he begins with, which are then realized and refined through its expedition through history. And in many respects, if you looked at that book, you'll find that his logical philosophical method appears to use the historical and the empirical as illustrations of the development of his categories. It's almost like the categories themselves, although logically presented, appear to be almost historically plausible, and they are. That's the beauty of it, is that the history unfolds as a set of concepts, but history itself has got an empirical reality to it. He tells us in his introduction to the philosophy of history that it begins with his philosophically developed ideas, particularly that reason exists in universal history, and that the world of intelligence and conscious volition is not abandoned to chance. It's not random or contingent, but must show itself in the light of self-cognizant ideas. He claims this inference is drawn from history. So, on the one hand, he's kind of a philosopher first and foremost, and a historian second. But at the same time, this is what's interesting about the book for me, is that he's very sensitive to the danger of relying too much on a priori claims, and just simply, kind of developing a history that's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And he actually warns that we must proceed historically and empirically. So there's a very clear recognition on his part of the fact that his history, indeed his philosophy, needs to be rooted within an empirical foundation. And in fact, he warns professional historians against introducing their a priori inventions into the records of the past. But despite his speculative orientation, or possibly because of it, Hegel's approach to history strikes a very modern historiographical sort of note. And the enterprise of being historian for him, and the existence of a subject matter that he works on, are in Hegel's sort of discussion internally and inextricably linked. The historian and the object of the historian's sort of reflection are very much kind of bound together. And he wrote in the introduction that history unites the objective with the subjective side and comprehends both what happened and the narration of what happened. And I think if you can think of Hegel as a philosophy historian that kind of continually sort of struggles with this tension between what happened and the narration of what happened, I think that's really a nice way of understanding him. And the fact that he attempts not to rupture the two. There's always that kind of a relationship. Sometimes an uneasy relationship, and sometimes even a very unclear relationship, but he's desperately trying to make that happen, force that to occur. He uses obviously dialectical categories to make sense of history. And around the breakfast table this morning, people were asking me to explain what dialectics is, which I'm always very loath to do, especially because every time I read something, this is dialectics, yawn, sort of go to sleep, because it's not something you can take out of that kind of context in that simple way. But I think that one of the ways of approaching the question of dialectics is that there's a nice little book by a guy called Joseph McCartney on Hegel's history. And he makes the point that the mainspring of dialectical unrest is not in that, it's a moving principle of the negative in general. And that it is through the workings of this principle that contradictions arise, and you think of these contradictions as almost like existing as pure change. The basic form of such thinking, and dialectics is not, I don't think we should fall into the Angus kind of trap or just think dialectics in an entirely kind of natural way, although there's a good argument that you can make for that. It's better to think of dialectics as a form of thinking. But the basic form of such thinking takes its reflection in grasping how it operates. The image of light waves meeting and being reflected, bent back from things is helpful. In that intellectual reflection, bounces thought, as it were, of its object and back into the self. And I think that Hegel, is, Rousseau is the first person that gets a glimmer of this, in modern, first person period. And Hegel is the one that really takes this kind of understanding a little bit further, that through reflection, there's a kind of shift in subjectivity and the way that reality is incorporated into this new experience. So consciousness caught in this interaction is thereby released from its fixity and implicated in the process of mediation and movement. In particular, it is provided with a ladder to a higher level of consciousness at each stage of that kind of reflection. But a reflective interaction with its object is at the same time a distancing from the self, a bringing of it under scrutiny from a new vantage point, and thereby a means of transcending the self-conception with which the process started. I think this is really the constitutive principle of his phenomenology. And if I want to have, whenever I think of it myself, I want to simplify it for myself, I always think of his thought as kind of establishing these new vantage points from which to kind of explore and interpret the phenomenon. So his basic principle is that human consciousness has an immanent logic of development, a logic whose bearers are the categories from negation to the recollection listed above. What makes Hegelian philosophy of history possible is the thesis that this logic can, in all essential and with due allowance for the change of setting, be transposed to history. So history then provides this kind of territory where, through the act of reflection, philosophical concepts and philosophical categories become refined and clarified. Spirit is the indispensable medium and vehicle of transposition, and therein lies its crucial significance for the architecture of Hegel's thought. The thesis that world history enshrines the logic of spirit is the beating heart of his entire project in this region of philosophy. Put it a little bit differently, human history progresses as humans become increasingly self-aware and as they are correspondingly becoming aware of their freedom, which unfortunately sometimes Hegel understands as being realized through the state. And that's more of his, I'll say a bit more later on, this kind of conservative side. So freedom on its own is an internal concept, but the means by which it's realized, the means by which it realizes itself in the world are necessarily external. So, it's the externalization through the historical process that allows freedom to gain meaning and definition. And these means are human needs, human drives, human passions, and human interests which drive history. And in comparisons to this, the normal theological, moral kind of categories are relatively insignificant for Hegel. If I had more time, I'd go into some of his other discussions. For example, there's a very rich discussion in the introduction on the role of interest and the way that human interests and human passions are really important. And normally, if I was talking to a group of undergraduates, I would give a whole lecture on interest. For a very simple reason, I live in a world where personal interest, individual interests are totally misunderstood. People think that if you're interested, there's something really wrong with that. You got an agenda. Whereas for Hegel, it is precisely the fact that that you got interest, that kind of immerses you into what you're interested in, that kind of has this creative, historical making dynamic to it. So he's got a very interesting discussion on the role of interest, because in his own way, although he's not really aware of it all the time, he's refining this very modern idea of human subjectivity, and he understands that at some level, in some place, somewhere, it's human beings that are, at least the means through which history is realized, even though it's often done in an unconscious or semi-conscious way. He's also got a very interesting discussion, which I find quite interesting, especially for those of you who were at the Louis XIV discussion yesterday, might want to kind of revisit his discussion of what he calls world historical individuals. The fact that there are these people, who are not like you and I, but they are sort of the makers of history, the personifications of historical trends. And his discussion on that is quite interesting, because these individuals are not simply credited with great achievements in any conventional sense. What they do is truly revolutionary in being the means through which the old order, the old world is destroyed, and in particular, in terms of laying the foundations for a new world, in terms of being those kinds of transitional figures. And Hegel gives some very interesting examples. The usual examples he gives are Alexander, not for nothing called the Great, not the average, not Alexander the average, Julius Caesar, Napoleon. I mean, it's interesting, all these people, they make things happen by the fact that there are metaphors that use them all the time, being a Napoleonic, has a certain kind of ring to it. These are conquerors of continents, and they show their exalted nature in a number of different ways. And as his discussion, although his discussion is often, a little bit one-sided, it's not always clear how they come to play such a crucial role. Thankfully, if you compare Hegel and his discussion of these great historical figures to the discussion in the 20th century and today, he really does avoid that psychologizing, Hitler had a bad dad and he therefore did bad stuff, kind of stuff, so that Napoleon, was short and therefore he wanted to, so I mean, he does avoid that kind of psychological history that has become extremely popular by biographers and other people elsewhere. And it should be emphasized that for Hegel, not only are world historical individuals not entitled to appeal to the court of world history, they don't have to do so. They really are above it in some sense. And in a sense, what they have are resources that are available in principle to everybody, but they're the only ones that can use them. They're the ones that understand or grasp or intuit processes before they can be made available to the rest of humanity. They become the means through which humanity comes to grasp something that's already there but needed these individuals. I think this point is really well illustrated by Hegel's little discussion on Julius Caesar, where he makes the point that in preparing the ground, Julius Caesar knew that the Roman Republic was alive. I mean, by the time Julius Caesar comes along, the Roman Republic, although outwardly, still exists, Julius Caesar knew that he was a lie, and Hegel tells us that Caesar realized that the supposed laws of auctoritas and dignitas, these are laws of authority, and these really are the way that the Senate, sort of is still meant to have this sacral kind of leading role, has fallen into abeyance, and that it was proper to put an end to the latter because it had become an arbitrary, irrelevant fact of life. And as Hegel says, he was able to accomplish this because, as he puts it, it was correct. Very blunt point, it was correct. And by what I mean that he was basically the right person in the right place, but with the intuition that was very special and very rare. And the implication of this is that, as before, the support needed for success was obtained because others could grasp the truth once it was brought home to them. In other words, Julius Caesar and other great people in history, in his account, are able to accomplish what they set out to do, because once they've, in a sense, pushed the button and indicated what needed to be done, there would be other people, the followers or the rest of society, that would see the bulb, lightening up and everything. And I think that's how they're able to play this kind of a role. So he understands the phenomenon of the world historical individuals in terms of their lifeline to the hidden spirit. This is what enables them to express the unconscious, rational impulse of their time. It is a truth that may be easily obscured amid all the attention of the drama of their roles as the great men of history. Which takes me then to what I think, for me, at any rate, is the most interesting idea, and often the idea that's most dismissed as being not that particularly subtle, and that's Hegel's idea of the cunning of reason. In fact, the more I read about it, the more I want to write a little book about it, or at least for myself, if nobody else, because obviously nobody would understand what I'm grappling with, certainly at this stage in time. The way in which he explains what the cunning of reason is in the introduction, is this. He says, it is not the universal idea which involves itself in opposition, struggle, and danger. It keeps itself in the background, untouched and unharmed. So, the idea that is there in the background. And this may be called the cunning of reason that allows the passions to work for it, whereby that through which it gives itself existence pays the penalty and suffers the harm. The idea pays the tribute of existence and of the past, not out of itself, but out of the passions of individuals. So, that which is in the background, in the end, gains gradual crystallization and clarity through the passion of individuals. So for Hegel, the cunning of reason is presented in this passage as the chief mediator of human passions and the idea, capital I, idea. That is to say, as the basic answer to the question, how passion and conflict combine in the historic fabric. It's a question that anybody that's intelligent and is sensitive to the world we live in is continually asking, how history unfolds, how what we do ends up with consequences that are not of our own making, and yet, when you look back upon them, there seems to be this incredible logic there. So one might well wonder how precisely it could be that world historical individuals, with their limited understanding and limitless passions, manage to advance the cause of the universal. And this is a problem that arises in the case of their followers too, and in the truth of all historical actors. How does that begin to occur? And he goes on to narrow the focus a little bit by declaring that those very life forms of individuals and peoples who are seeking to satisfy their own ends are at the same time the means and the instruments of something higher and broader, for which they know nothing, and which they unconsciously fulfill. Now, for those of you that study philosophy and or particularly the history of history, you will know that the cunning of reason is obvious enough, because in some form it arises in any speculative philosophy of history, at least for anyone who views the overall story as in some sense, however vague or attenuated, one of progress. I mean, you've got to be able to account for the fact, how does this occur? And you have a challenge of explaining how impure, insensible, or base forces can yield results that transcend their own aspirations. And it seems inevitable that the progressive movement will have to be seen as occurring in large measure behind the back of the consciousness of human participants. And it's this behind the back kind of process that one is trying to tease out and make sensible. The term cunning is bound to have a certain appeal in this context in view of the indirection, complexity, or mediation and surprise that the process involves. Now, if you look at philosophical history, the idea of the cunning of reason is already evident, is already there in the writings of Immanuel Kant, who writes of the hidden character of nature's plan that is hidden from human agents through which it's implemented. And he writes about, and others touch on this, how nature makes use of base means through which it's implemented. And this argument is then taken further by Hegel in his discussion of passion and interest. Unlike some of the other writers, Hegel operates with a very rich concept, a very important concept, which is that of historical necessity. Historical necessity, which for Hegel, the necessity of the rational and intelligible subjectivity to which we belong and which we participate at varying levels of consciousness as vehicles of spirit. And sometimes in his writings it comes across as logical necessary progression, which is exact and acted through some hidden design. If you kind of pause for a moment on this idea of the cunning of reason, it is important to realize, and this is where you can see how Hegel is a man of his time, is that the concept of the cunning of reason, like in fact, a lot of his categories, a lot of the concepts that he uses, are actually drawn from philosophical discussions of his time. So in other words, it's important not to kind of imagine that Hegel woke up one morning and had developed this system, because he's drawing on people before him and writing at the same time. And sometimes because of his kind of intricate web of categories, you can lose sight of the fact. You can think, my God, this guy just invented all these, obscure concepts that I can barely pronounce. Never mind understand. But actually, as a historian of ideas, you could see that they are, sort of, at least in part, overlapping with important concepts and categories that are already in existence. So, for example, if you got problems with the cunning of reason idea, just think of Adam Smith and political economy and the hidden hand of history. It's a very similar idea, although Smith is less dialectical than Hegel is. It's kind of used in a slightly different way. And similarly, as Adam Smith got the idea of the hidden hand of markets, it's actually a very rich idea, which is often rendered banal in kind of contemporary kind of discussions. But it's not just simply Adam Smith. If you look at Immanuel Kant and his analysis of civil society, where he basically struggles with this problem of how does the asocial sociability of men and their exercise of freedom result in positive outcomes. Now we're talking about very similar kind of processes which people are aware of, because in that middle to late 18th and early 19th century, you do have this kind of, my God, sort of, how did this come about? And that's what you've got to account for, because you do have, for the first time, an unprecedented, a very intense sense of change and mutation and transformation, where you can make the links, but then there is potentially a real crisis of causality, which you need to sort of make sense of. Hegel, in his writings, sort of, although he's got a certain teleology, he does avoid what I think is always the really weak side of theological thought, especially in its religious form. He avoids the theology of origins, sort of the kind of the beginning of the story discussions, and therefore his and this is where I think his real revolutionary potential begins to kick in, Hegel is not really about the recovery of a truth that's been lost in the way that you often have, particularly in medieval philosophy, where you gotta almost kind of get back to it and rediscover it. He asserts in the introduction that world history does not begin with any kind of conscious end, and instead it begins with its universal end, that the concept of the spirit should be realized. There's a kind of openness about his writing at that point. You know, that it's not a story that's insurmountable. It's not a story that's kind of shut down. And you know, sort of, he says it begins with a universal end, that the spirit, that the concept of the spirit should be realized. This is at first only the innermost unconscious drive, and the entire business of world history is the labor of bringing it to consciousness. So, you know, that's his, you know, kind of teleology in a sense, and it's in a sense it's both non-theological because of its, you know, sort of kind of lack of sort of that defined meaning that is there, that is kind of fixed in stone. There's a certain necessity for realizing the unconscious to the conscious, but at the same time there's also a recognition that history is the gradual hardening of a purpose as it clearly moves sort of towards a definable end. Just to kind of speed up a little bit, history, when you look at philosophical discussion of history, it's always interesting to ask the question, and I'll deal with this, I think, tomorrow when I'm looking at big history, is when does history begin? Because that tells you a lot about the philosophical assumptions. Wherever you begin history, you know, it says a lot about not just the starting point, but your assumptions about humanity. And just to make a long story short, Hegel begins his history with the state, or at any rate, you know, sort of basically he's struck with the fact that the human past, which he considers to be the historical past, not the natural past, is something that arrives when the state kind of begins to kind of kick in. And for him, history and the state are indissolubly linked. He gives a number of reasons as to why history begins with the state. The most important being that as a community that raises itself up to the state, it requires rules, laws, universal truths, universality, universal binding directives, and it's through the state that the universal and the spirit comes to be internalized and institutionalized. And the state needs history because it produces a record of an interest in intelligent and understandable and everlasting actions, to which, as he puts it, Memosyne, the goddess of memory, is then impelled to a duration and remembrance. So basically, we're not just talking about an entirely instrumental, historical, kind of bureaucratic reason why the state needs history. Historical narrative is deeply inherent in the state as an integral moment of its development in a way that goes well beyond what would be mundanely required for the legal system to function. I think when it gets into the discussion of the state, you know, sort of Hegel goes a little bit pear-shaped, you know, sort of, and that's partially because, you know, it's now the post-Napoleonic moment. You know, things are not pretty grim in Europe. He begins to draw fairly conservative conclusions, and you can see, for example, in his discussion of God, that towards the end of the introduction, he introduces this theodicy, where the central thesis of Hegel's philosophy of history is that history, which is the progress of consciousness and freedom, is ultimately rely to a justification of God. And that's his favorite self-description, particularly towards the end of his life. And one of the last things that he says in the introduction, or in the philosophy of history, says that the history of the world, with all the changing scene, with all its annals present, is this process of development and the realization of spirit that is the true, I can never pronounce the Greek, TDCIE, the justification of God in history, only in his insight can reconcile spirit with the history of the world, that what has happened and is happening every day is not only not without God, but his essential work. So what you end up with is the deification of, using God, the deification of the state. And as Lukács points out in his wonderful little book on Hegel, not that little as it happens, shorter than some of the other ones, it was after his disillusionment with Hegel that Hegel became closer to accepting contemporary German actuality, and his reconciliation with the Prussian state occurred, which is really summed up with that often quoted and often misunderstood sort of metaphor: what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational. And his, the actuality representing this kind of final moment of rationality, which then leads to the hypothesis of the moment, the present, and what my co-patriot István Mészáros called the arbitrary closure of the historical dynamic in the framework of the modern state. Now, can I just say a few things of my own on this? Sort of, I give a completely objective, neutral representation of Hegel. But just to kind of say a few sort of points on, particularly on the idea of the openness of history, which I think is a really dominant theme that Hegel grapples with, and in the end doesn't really resolve satisfactorily. But I also think it's the key question of the 21st century. So for us living in the 21st century, it is one of the key problems that we face with. Human history cannot have meaning or be rendered intelligible without some kind of teleology. I think that's for sure. I mean, even the anti-teleologists end up with a teleology of their own. But the only teleology that's consistent with a human-centered representation of history is one that is oriented towards an open-ended future, where the options for human development and the development of humanity are not foreclosed. I think that's really quite important, because if you look at history today in all of its forms, not just Fukuyama with the end of history, but the all-closed history, human history. I mean, environmental history is the best example, where at a certain point our future depends on carbon, and the future depends upon whether it's rainy or sunny, and this overwhelming naturalistic moment where natural history gradually meshes with human history. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, but essentially there's very few studies that you can now confront and see where the open-ended character can be affirmed. At a basic ontological level, such history is focused in the way that human beings change themselves through acting on the world through purposeful and conscious activity. The self-mediating humanist teleology is based on the fundamental premise that qualitative change brought about by the exercise in subjectivity can only be captured through history that is resolutely open-ended. Hegel's idea, or emphasis on the idea, is an idealism, and dying idea with reality has the potential for overcoming the Kantian dualism between being and consciousness, and that's really where it's a huge leap forward. In the introduction, one of the means whereby freedom develops itself into the world is the activity of human beings in the world at large. To begin with, Hegel's attention is fixed on individual human beings, though this will turn out not to be, in the end, his deepest and most characteristic concern. The springs of their activity are variously said to consist of need, drive, inclinations, and passions, and interests. And the chief organizational motion in this slit, at any rate, is one that's used to represent it as passion. Thus, Hegel declares that the idea and human passion compromise the warp and weft of history. But unfortunately, as you look at it a little bit closer, this is only a formal unity. And the scope for subjectivity is restricted by the fact that the relationship between philosophy and history remains unresolved and unmediated. He recognizes that history has both an objective and subjective dimension, but does not attempt, I don't think he could have attempted at that point in time, does not attempt to theorize how knowledge itself has a transformative role. So insofar as there's a real limit to his dialectics and to his incredible sensitivity towards human subjectivity, it's his reluctance to understand that knowledge itself has a transformative role. And therefore, for Hegel, the philosopher, the role of the philosopher, is that of providing after-the-event knowledge, post-factum knowledge, a kind of retrospective consciousness. So what philosopher does, as an old German economist once said, interpret the world, and kind of leave it at that. Although there's more to him, actually, than that. And I think that one of the things that we should all do from time to time, when we're thinking about the problem of interpretation as opposed to transformation, and what the subtle relationship between that is, to read Hegel's famous passage in the preface of his philosophy of right, something that's well worth reading if you ever get frustrated at the world, and if you're finding that you've come to understand something a little bit too late after it's pretty irrelevant, which is the story of my life. I happen to have the most brilliant insights in the wrong places at the wrong time with the wrong people. Anyway, as Hegel argued in this famous passage, he says this. Please let me read that. It's a bit long. He says, "Only one word more concerning the desire to teach the world what it ought to be. For such a purpose, philosophy at least always comes too late. Philosophy, as the thought of the world, does not appear until reality has completed its formative process and made itself ready. History thus corroborates the teaching of the conception that only in the maturity of reality does the ideal appear as counterpart to the real, apprehends the real world in its substance, and shapes it into an intellectual kingdom. When philosophy paints its gray in gray, one form of life has become old. And by means of gray, it cannot be rejuvenated, but only known. The owl of Minerva takes its flight only when the shades of night are gathering." I don't know about you, but I've experienced this many, many times where, you get the, you kind of wait, you say to yourself, I'm not yet ready because I don't quite understand it, and in my case that becomes like a displacement activity, that's how I kind of see it. But of course, by the time you understand it, it's a little bit too late, because the moment has gone. And I think that's one of the existential, intellectual struggles that many of us has, which I think to some extent Hegel acquiesces to in this passage about the owl of Minerva. Because what Hegel sees the idea of the driver, which humanity realized through its action, but of course the idea is humanity's idea, a form of self-consciousness based on being and the experience of history. And I think we need to think about this a little bit. I actually quite like a little passage that E.H. Carr, I don't know if you're at E.H. Carr's What is History, or I'm not sure about the exact title, but it really, people make fun of it, this is now dated, very old, crap and everything. Actually, it's got some very useful insights. And what E.H. Carr says, what E.H. Carr's verdict is on Hegel's history, says this: Hegel clothed his absolute in the mystical shape of world spirit and made the cardinal error of bringing the course of history to an end in the present instead of projecting it into the future. He goes on to say, he recognizes a process of continuous evolution in the past and incongruously denies it in the future. And that's really the basic problem with Hegel, insofar as there's a problem. And of course, for us in the 21st century, we know that the future will be unlike the present. But us too, like Hegel, instead of facing up to the future, we would rather bring it to an end far too prematurely. And I think the challenge really is to take on board what Hegel done in relation to the past, in terms of history, but do not stop with God and the Prussian state, and be ready to yield to the experience of the future, and be prepared for that intellectual challenge, both individually and together collectively in solidarity. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got 2 microphones at the front. With your hands up, I'd like to speak. Okay, one here and then one in the middle.
Thanks very much, Frank. That was pretty interesting. But my problem with Hegel is you've mentioned the hidden spirit or the ideal becoming real. I think it's what Ryle called the category error that's at the heart of Hegel's philosophy. That you can only understand it so far as a sort of representation of individual thoughts, but you kind of can't take Hegel without this ideal somehow existing outside of the individuals who have it. I mean, you mentioned Adam Smith and the hidden hand of the market, but we can construct a model where we can still talk about it as if there's a hidden hand of the market, but we don't actually need to have a real hidden hand manipulating things, because the sum of the actions of the individuals is what creates the appearance of there being a hidden hand. And I think the trouble with Hegel, he's saying, like, if you don't have this concept of a hidden hand, something driving it, some hidden spirit, you know, how do you account for the transformations that happen with the base material that goes to make it up? Well, of course, the answer to that is quite simple. Yes, we can do it nowadays, can't we? In computer sciences, we're looking at game theory, we're looking at complexity models. We can actually understand how the actions of lots of individuals doing stuff in the real world can end up with results that give the appearance of something greater masterminding the solution. If you remove that basic sort of understanding of there being an ideal, doesn't the whole of Hegel's philosophy kind of collapse? Is it possible to have a Hegelian view without that metaphysical element?
Okay, good. And can I see others?
Yes. So you mentioned obviously that Hegel said about how there are key figures in history and how they can come to have large impacts through their particular personalities, and they are at the right moment, at the right time, with the right sort of inspiration. But then at the same time, that there is some sort of historical necessity that's obviously this guiding principle running through the realization of the spirit. So is Hegel agreeing with Tolstoy, say, where he says that it's not about the individual people in particular places, that history will evolve in the same way, whoever's involved in it, because certain things are inevitably going to happen and it doesn't really matter who brings them about? Or is Hegel's view that history is shaped by the individuals involved in it, and does he believe that individuals really do change the course of history in a way that wouldn't have happened if that particular person, you know, for some reason wasn't at that particular place, wasn't alive, wasn't able to influence things?
Yeah, very good question. Just in front of you there.
Thanks. Frank, there was one passage that really struck me, and I just wanted to get your comment on just this very brief quote where he says, "Just as the germ of the plant carries within itself the entire nature of the tree, even the taste and shape of its fruit, so the first traces of spirit virtually contain all history." And in relation to what you were saying at the end, my question is, I didn't read that in a very deterministic way. It seemed to me to be talking about a very sort of fundamental process that he was trying to explain, and it could be read in a very open-ended way. But I was sort of thinking, is he basically saying at some point you end up, all-knowing? Is it plausible for humanity to end up being all-knowing? And then, so is Hegel being a bit deterministic? How does it relate to your final points?
Do you want to maybe take those last two together?
I think last week they're all very good, very difficult questions. Is this more of this microphone?
If you turn it on.
To the story of my life, I'm never good at turning anything on. Right. I I think that on the Tolstoy question, it's quite interesting because Hegel can be seen to have this almost religious-like metaphysics, you know, in the Tolstoyan sense, but actually he doesn't. I think what distinguishes Hegel from someone like Tolstoy is that although he says that within history itself there is this striving for the realization of freedom, and although he actually locates that already within nature itself, within nature there's already a reasoning to be unleashed and crystallized. Nevertheless, I think this is what's fascinating about Hegel is that his determinism is mediated. He's got a very mediated, and this relates also to the tree issue as well, is that it's not a matter of indifference as to how history is realized. In other words, it isn't just going to happen in a kind of obvious kind of a sense. The individuals who personify a particular overriding moment within the unfolding of the drama actually do imprint their personality on the subject matter of history. And I think what's fascinatingly interesting about Hegel, and totally different to the dialectics, as far as I understand it, beforehand, is that in the course of this interrelationship, both parties in the relationship change themselves. So the subjectivity of the actor and that which is acted upon, you know, alter the course of events. And I think for that reason, there is within Hegel both a kind of contingent, you know, sort of a relatively open-ended element. There's that side of it, as well as the fact that there's this overriding element of necessity, which at a certain point, you know, sort of is realized through its identification, its common identity with freedom. And that's related to the tree issue, because I think, you know, you could read that, you know, history is already given, you know, in the embryo. That's how environmental history operates today. If you look at environmental history, it's already the Big Bang happens, you know, and the little proteins, you know, are what binds us, you know, makes us who we are, rather than what we as human beings, you know, have actually done. I think that one can read that metaphor that he uses as to do with a potential. And I think that Hegel's history and his philosophy is really about potential and its realization, and how something that's there in potential is realized requires history, it requires human beings who are the actors through which this is done. And I know that in the end he violates this by bringing God. I mean, but that, you know, it is really a bringing of God from, you know, it's a really Deus ex machina business. Kind of, you bring it in, you know, sort of in a way that's kind of quite external to the event. I totally disagree with you, you know, sort of, and I think that the reason why I disagree with you is because actually, you know, sort of, there is a sense in which what Hegel does is, you know, you do have to take his kind of concepts, his a priori concept as the starting point. But if you look at his a priori concepts, you know, sort of, and you kind of, you know, sort of, in its crystal pure way, you kind of get rid of its secondary kind of factors. Those a priori concepts are his recognition that human history is really about, you know, sort of our realization of, through our consciousness, through the evolution of our self-consciousness, of a certain freedom from necessity. And that is something that is historically, empirically reflected by a number of key points of transition. I think it's reflected by our gradual sort of movement away from nature, and the way that, you know, sort of in the course of moving away from nature, we humanize ourselves, we become more and more the accomplishments of our actions rather than of our genes and of our biology. And as we're doing that, then the you know, sort of our capacity to, you know, sort of gain sort of a sense of what history is about and freedom is about gains greater and greater clarity. And I think that is something that is historically, that's very, I think it's really, really good, comes in and kicks in. And I don't know if you recall in the introduction, he's got a clue. I mean, they all have this tripartite division of history. And he talks about how, you know, in the beginning, freedom was only the freedom of the single emperor or the ruler in Asia. That's what and freedom only meant his own freedom and nobody else's. And then he goes on to say that once you got to the Romans, you know, sort of, then you have, I think the Greeks as well, you know, sort of, then you have the freedom of the few. But not everybody. Freedom is still seen in a very narrow, selective kind of a way. And then he says, and then we finally get to Germany, and not just Germany, but Protestant Germany. This is really where there's a kind of weakness in his argument. Then, you know, to the state, we begin to realize, you know, that freedom is something that is for all, is something that's equally accessible. And I think that that there is a kind of sense in which, you know, his grappling with the unfolding of the historical process as being that of history is a right way of going about it. Now, you know, some people who are totally one-sidedly empiricists would fail to grasp it because they cannot understand why we would want to impose upon the world that we live in this kind of interpretation. And my argument is that, you know, whether we like it or not, at some level we have to give our existence meaning. And this is, you know, human beings are continually in quest of meaning. We're always searching for meaning. And history is probably the main, and philosophy, and in fact I hate to separate the two, are one of the main ways that we're doing it. And that's something that you cannot reduce to models or, you know, sort of, or numbers. It's not something that you can measure. You cannot measure qualitative change and qualitative relation and subjectivity through the language of figures. And I think all that we can say is we either think conceptually, abstractly, and dialectically, or we have a different kind of abstraction, which is the empiricist abstraction, which is just as abstract, but in a different way, as because numbers are, you know, abstract as well as philosophical thought is.
The abstract, the abstraction. Come on, Kevin.
I'm just wondering why you're not talking about the morality of history, because what you seem to be talking about is moral agency in the end. And it's more just out of curiosity why you're not emphasizing that aspect. Are you avoiding the term, or is it just that accidental that you haven't mentioned it?
Good question. Let's see a few more hands. Yep.
A couple of things, just on the point about empiricism. I think one writer said about dialectics that it's like saying hunting isn't just those heads on the wall. You know, the dialectical process is one of looking at the context and of looking at everything that surrounds particular events, not just the event, not just the numbers in isolation. I'm just wondering, Frank, about your take on the kind of Arab Spring, and whether this is an illustration of history moving towards one common shared universal idea.
Take you and Chrissy, and I've got a quick question, and I'll bring Frank back. Okay, Dennis as well.
Thanks. Yeah, just on this, on sort of teleology, and yeah, you know, does he have this idea of sort of the absolute sitting behind and pulling all the strings? I mean, is it you know, you mentioned this word retrospective, and it seems to me that Hegel is just so caught up in this kind of logic and this sort of retrospective way of thinking that actually, if there is any teleology, it is only ever, you know, when the owl of Minerva's taken flight. Well, you know, teleology is teleology without a telos. You know, it's the end does not exist until you've reached it already, and then you can go back and say, you know, A was always going to lead to B. I just don't think you can do that until you've got to B. But I think that's in Hegel as well. I mean, you know, whether it's in the logic or philosophy of history or whatever, you know, that he does have that side to him as well.
Yes, so Rosa, down here.
Hi, I'd like to bring Freud in prematurely. So, if that's fine. I mean, the fact that I'm doing it prematurely might have some Freudian meaning. Yeah, I think a misunderstanding of Freud, many of the sort of philosophers that were in the Hegel's tradition simply reject Freud outright because, and Freud is partly responsible, the misunderstanding or the misreading there is that Freud suggests that the subject is fractured and you can't continue a Hegelian history unless you have a subject which is whole and singular. And the way I understand that is really that the psyche may be fractured, but that has no bearing on the condition of the subject. Which brings me really to a point which is Hegel's understanding of the unfolding of history is posited on his concept of contradiction, which implies some form of resolution, which may take many different forms. And how is that different from an understanding where history may be fractured rather than contradictory?
Okay, we've got Dennis.
It's a question really about Hegel's and your analysis of reflection, because it seems to me largely metaphorical and I don't quite understand what the process of reflection is. I don't mean just the psychological process, but what actually happens, because it doesn't seem sufficient to rely on a metaphor, because I just did not understand it either from you or from Hegel for that matter.
Take Nancy and then big back.
What does it mean for history when the whole concept of the universal is up for question?
Yeah? Well, actually, the universal isn't up for question. In fact, there's never been so many universal histories as now. I mean, if you look at all these, and I'll talk about this, all these big histories and everything else. The trouble is that universal history has been really emptied of meaning, and it's acquired a very shallow, material, naturalistic, sort of quality to it. It's almost like a Gaia theory of history, to kind of put it kind of crudely. And I think that whenever universalism and the aspiration for universality becomes enfeebled, it's always invariably, and without exception, an expression of the fact that the quest for freedom has been thwarted, and there's a kind of conservative sort of pulling back from it. And that's usually what happens. That's why you have the emergence, as you have today, of more particularistic identity politics, more particularistic from the lifestyle politics, more it's all about me kind of ideals being kind of represented. But that's just a moment in historical time. I wouldn't worry too much about it, because it's just a blink of the eye and we're back to history yet again. When you use the word fracture, history fractured, a Hegelian equivalent would be it's a moment that a process that could not find its mediation, and therefore it's a kind of unmediated way that kind of the unfolding of events sort of becomes unsettled, and that's how I would understand it. And I think it's I prefer Hegel, because Hegel's idea of mediation sort of provides us with a way of understanding change as a kind of process that changes you, the observer, as much as what it is that you are observing, which relates to reflection. I think I'm surprised what you say about reflection, because I'm sure that almost everyone in this room must have had the experience that that through the process of reflecting on a problem, sort of and genuinely engage. It doesn't happen always, because we're always scared to genuinely engage always in a problem. It's very tiring that you feel that you become a slightly different person, and that what it is that kind of the problem that constituted itself initially has a different, different quality to it. And all that Hegel has said, and I think this is a really important part of it, is that in the act, the historian, sort of narrates history, his narrative, both changes what is being narrated, and the narrator is no longer, sort of exactly what he was beforehand. On the question of morality and why I didn't speak about morality, I thought I did when I spelled out what a humanist theology is. I think that from a humanist point of view, we don't need to have morality with a capital M. And we certainly don't need to moralize. What basically a humanist approach towards morality is that what is moral, I suppose, is that which allows the quest for freedom and the quest for human development to acquire greater definition. And I would see my morality as, and I think that humanists, from a humanist perspective, we are as moral as anybody else is. Which is why I often get really angry whenever you got this program, Thoughts for the Day, and you got these little fuckers, sort of speaking for like, who haven't even read the Bible, never mind anything else. And this morning I woke up and and whatever, and I saw this. Whereas, and they think that because they belong to a church, that gives them this automatic moral high ground. Whereas, sort of if you have a genuine sort of open-ended humanist view of the world, then your sense of right and wrong and good and evil, all these things, are sort of actually more in tune with reality than anybody else's. I'm not, I don't want to question anybody else's, because I respect other people's way that they kind of make sense of the world. But I do think that that there is a kind of profound moral dynamic that's contained within sort of this kind of thought and this kind of thinking. So I just want to sort of indicate that there's a question about
teleology without a telos.
Teleology without, that's right, teleology without telos. I think that what you've got within Hegel is obviously there are moments when Hegel does acquire this kind of one-sided theological, sort of very tired, sort of a kind of expression, and he kind of sees that history has now come to an end, and that's really it. But there is within Hegel also a kind of a very relaxed way of talking about the way in which freedom itself kind of gradually unfolds through the spirit, the way in which humanity itself acts as the unwitting agent of change, but in the process gains greater and greater kind of self-consciousness. And I would say that what you've got with Hegel is both a telos that he has at some of the time, but also sort of a kind of almost like a kind of a reluctance to adopt the metaphysical kind of religious positions that teleologists had earlier on. There's one other question which is very important that I totally can't read my handwriting, basically.
Put your hand up if your question's not been answered.
Arab Spring.
Arab Spring, yeah. I think the Arab Spring is not so much, it's more like what Marx talked about second time it's farce. He talks about the French Revolution being dressed in the clothes of Rome and Greece. I think what's really horrible about the Arab Spring is not what people want, but that the language and the way in which it makes sense of itself is far too reliant on the poetry of the past. And therefore, in that sense, sort of, can very easily, well, it's already lost its way to some extent, and has become, really become very easily the puppets of powerful groups. And I was horrified. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but I was really horrified the way in which people are giving a standing ovation to what is a military coup. I just think that, where did these guys come from? I mean, I didn't believe in democracy even when, the ballot box was against us. Or we say that, bring on the generals, and that equals Pinochet in Chile. I mean, what's the difference between Pinochet in Chile you know, sort of, and what happens in Egypt, except that you don't like Pinochet, but you think this guy is a right-on, you know, sort of individual.
So I had Penny, and Alan, and Tessa.
I just wondered if you could say a bit about the German ideology. Why Hegel seems to be the best way to talk about the significance of history today, rather than what the young Hegelians might have thought about it. And on that question, I was just wondering that it seems to me when you look at historiography from the latter part of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, there's a very strong reaction against the idea of history made by important individuals, and it becomes very much about the history of things and objects and innovation. So humanity is always one step displaced from the process of making history. And I wondered if you thought that Marx and or the materialist side of things in response to that relationship between subject and object had in it was sort of part of that 20th century historiography of emphasising the material side of things as opposed to human agency.
Yeah, that's a really important question, because there's a legitimate criticism of big man history and a horrible reason. And the legitimate criticism of big man history is that it kind of attributes these special qualities, these unique qualities to this genius who somehow, sort of rises above all and single-handedly transforms the world. And often it's kind of posed in a very elitist kind of a way, where there are these couple of people that can make history, and the rest of us just sit there and give them a standing ovation. And that's a kind of legitimate way of doing it. But the problem is that in the 21st century, what has happened is that criticisms of the big man version of history are actually criticisms of human subjectivity. And what they're really actually criticizing is the capacity of human beings to make the world. And if you look at historical, I have to look at the English history curriculum. It's one of my bugbears. But if you look at the history curriculum, it kind of purports to be ever so democratic, because it looks at little people like cleaning ladies and nurses and everything else. So everybody is treated as of equal worth. Whether you clean up, sort of an office, or you kind of save the lives of thousands of people, it doesn't really matter. It's all treated the kind of, and it seems ever so democratic and ever so. But basically, what you're saying is that actually, what we do, and this is what history is the dreary behavior of everyday banal action, and that's what history is kind of reduced to. And what that really basically says is that we are not so much the subjects of our history, we're the objects. And that's basically what we are, and our role is basically to carry out. And these days you get an OBE and an MB and BBE, I don't know, whatever they call them. I mean, because you take children across the road in their school. Now, I've got no problem with it. I think these ladies and gentlemen are really important. The future of Britain's children depends on it. But to give, where does these governments come from? To give them OBEs as marks of distinction. I mean, how banal can you get? I mean, how much do you want to empty these things out? Meaning, and that's what we're doing with history, in the way this is kind of criticized. Sort of in the way I just remember the question that was asked about teleology, end of teleology, and the answer that I should have given is that although Hegel arrives at all these things like everybody else retrospectively, and he's a little bit different, because there is retrospection and there's retrospection, sort of, and there is, most people wouldn't even recognize that as an issue. At least Hegel, the very fact that Hegel says what he says about the owl of Minerva, indicates that he intuitively understands that maybe there is more to life than just simply commenting after the event. And certainly in his own writings, in a number of places, there are some very suggestive passages that indicates that what he is doing is really a desire to not just simply kind of interpret what happened, but to provide very clear signposts to what is going to occur. Unfortunately, in the discussion at the moment, I mean the last 100 years, there's been this sort of attempt to counterpose Marx to Hegel on this particular point. So, as you recall, one of the theses of Feuerbach, I'm always bad at quoting, but something like philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it. And in the English empiricist left-wing sense, that often meant that you could be an intellectual cretin. As long as you want to change the world, that's all right. It's kind of become a call for kind of narrow kind of activism. And that somehow, I remember hearing once Tony Cliff, the head of the ethnology, saying how, what was the expression he used? Theory is grey, and action is, I don't know what was the color that he used, but the idea was that, theory we can, sort of, that's for,
Theory up to the level of our practice.
Right, that's all right, yeah. But you get the idea that theoreticians are these overweight, guys who are paralyzed from the neck down, and all they can do is just, sort of mumble to each other, and what they do is no kind of moment. But actually, if you read the thesis of Feuerbach, Marx himself is not saying that interpretation is something that we should really kind of scoff at and we should not take particularly seriously. What he's grappling with is something a little bit more. As it happens, Marx himself doesn't resolve that problem. I mean, nobody has ever resolved that problem between theory and practice, or because I don't think you can resolve that problem. The reason why you cannot resolve that problem is for the very simple reason that the problems that philosophy sets itself, sort of cannot be in the end sort of philosophically. But that in no way diminishes the importance of philosophy. Because basically, you're not going to get to that point unless you got the philosophical apparatus and the insight to make sense of those kinds of events. So I'm actually, despite my reservations about Hegel, the very fact that he kind of puts that problem on the table in a very open, sort of kind of a way, is something that we can take away and think about and reflect on and take forward, sort of. And maybe amongst you in this room, there's a budding Hegel who's going to, sort of make the kind of conceptual leaps that are comparable to what he did, sort of. Because that's really what is the challenge that is set for us, not to go back to the past always, not to simply read the old philosophical text, but to do our own theoretical work that's comparable, that's analogous, at least, to what they've done.
What was that? Alan and Tessa.
Just very briefly, I think looking at the Arab Spring, the sort of apocryphal anecdote which springs to mind from this Chu Enlai's comment on the French Revolution is too early to tell. But the world order is unravelling, and the fast, horrible events are out of control, and that's the most interesting thing compared with previous periods. And my main question is this, on Hegel and the Prussian state, leaving God aside. If you were in the first 2 decades of the 19th century and you'd gone into the bookies with your money and said, I'll tell you what, the Prussian state is going to be the most important country in Europe in 60, 70 years' time, you'd have got pretty long odds. So, was Hegel insightful? Is it an accident? Was it inevitable? Or is Hegel partly responsible for the success of the Prussian state?
I sort of wonder as well about freedom. If we're in the teleology in a humanistic sense of working towards a open-ended future, so if history does not start with the state, but starts in freedom, and it ends in freedom, but you don't end in freedom because it's not the kind of thing you could end in, there must be more of it, then in what way is freedom determined? See, freedom starts in it, works towards it, keeps working towards it, and then it has to happen. But how do we, I will be accused by at least one person in this audience of being formulaically not thinking about freedom, but you know what I mean? How does the logic of it work out? Tessa?
So in conceptualizing what is happening and why and the motor of change in the present, here and now, how then would you explain a way of not falling into Hegel's trap and only understanding those changes after the events, as he seems to emphasise. That's not his whole story, but after reality is settled, which sort of is a bit late, he's saying, and not quite what we're capable of. And then also not looking backwards for the causes of history in the past, which would fall into the mistake of rewriting history perhaps and seeing the germs of the present and the past, even though they weren't seen like that in the past.
Where was it? Mike?
Yes, somebody mentioned my friend Sigmund. I think it's important to recognise that it wasn't Freud who single-handedly created the idea of a diminished or fractured or an unwhole subject. I mean, he himself made the point that he added to a process that began with Copernicus, who firstly displaced the humanity from the sense of itself as being at the centre of the universe. A process that then proceeded with Darwin, who constructed the notion of man as being a part of the animal kingdom, which then Freud supplemented with his notion of the human subject as having a substantial subconscious, unconscious element, as well as a conscious subjective element. So Freud advanced an understanding of the human being as an embodied subject, or as you might say, an embrained subject, even an em-minded subject, who is, dialectically restricted in all those ways in the relationship between the human individual and the natural and social worlds. More tomorrow.
Ben. Behind you.
Just a small question, but a little bit confused, Frank, what you just said about when you were quoting the thesis on Feuerbach. In the back of my mind somewhere, there is some pages of Lukács that I read a long time ago, where he does try and, I think, he did try and grapple with the philosophy and interpreting the world in different ways, and try to understand reality to the point that actually your understanding can allow you to be the active agent of forming the future and control of that, and its relationship with organisation, people trying to do that working together. It's in some part of a Lukács, but I thought that was his contribution. He really did try and move the whole thing on a little bit.
Are there any more? Last minute, quick question.
Yeah, just on that, and also that, because that relates to Tessa's point about how can we avoid just one-sided retrospective commentary after the event. Well, we cannot avoid that. There's nothing really wrong with learning from the past and analyzing the past. I mean, I think a good retrospective interpretation of the human experience is far better than having none at all. And just kind of almost like cutting yourself off from the past and not really carrying that legacy forward. And the problem that we're confronted with is that whatever we do, whatever we strive to understand, is to some extent influenced by the circumstances within which we live. We are, for better or worse, the products of our time. And that, I'm saying that not as an excuse or as a call for resignation or simply being passive, but we are products of the time. And you have to remember, if we take the discussions yesterday, I mean, Hobbes wrote what he did, in the middle of the English Civil War. And Rousseau, when he was writing, for example, he wasn't, writing in the most placid of moments. He had a whole, sort of background that was, sort of haunting his thinking. And Hegel, could not have written what he did if it hadn't been for the fact that he, kind of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic, invasion of Europe had not occurred, which is, they don't explain what he said, but they provide a context within which, important insights are acquired. And what I would say is that the avoidance of retrospective thinking is very, very difficult. And I've never come across anybody, in all my reading, including Marx, who's been able to not be a retrospective thinker all of the time. It's not something that you can, because it is a very tiring kind of experience. You cannot continually question and critically engage with reality without being becoming a little bit exhausted. And therefore, in the course of human history, there are these moments, sort of when the possibility of great leaps forward, intellectual leap forwards can occur. And we don't know when that occurs. All that we can do is be, sort of participating in being ready for that kind of adventure as intellectuals, as theoreticians. And no doubt, there are moments when we have a capacity to, sort of intuit future trends with greater clarity than is the case in most situations. That's really what we should be trying to. I know myself, in terms of my own experience, my own biography, that so often, sort of, I'm really ready to see what I've seen before. I recognize things all too clearly. And I now know that whenever I recognize problems all too clearly, I'm being a little bit intellectually dishonest. Because the very fact that I see it all too clearly means that I'm living off the past. That's what retrospective thing is. You're kind of living off your past insight, sort of, which is always a very tempting thing to do because it's worked before. You think it's worked before. It kind of might kind of work again. And I think to a greater or lesser extent, most of us do it. But as long as we understand that this is a problem that we need to, sort of overcome, and only we can do that, by the way. And this is, I think, sort of what my lesson is by relying on other people to tell us that you are living over the past. This is where mutual criticism and discussion and dialogue does become, really sort of quite important. Hegel, sort of was very clearly a betting man. He followed the odds, and his prediction, although he didn't actually predict it in that kind of a sense, proved right. I think that it principally proved right for reasons that he could not have foreseen. I don't think that he could have foreseen that the French Republic would turn into a decadent, sort of introverted, sort of social phenomenon. Now, here's France, played this incredible role in the 17th, 18th century with these incredible philosophers and all the rest of that. And all of a sudden, in the 19th century, it just becomes this very corrupt, oligarchical, sort of perverted, in a kind of politically perverted sense, which then allows Germany a phenomenal, sort of room for expansion. I don't know that anybody could have predicted, and that's really where, there is an element of contingency, which Hegel is quite okay about, and that's also one of the good things about Hegel, in that he does combine an element of determination with contingency, and you've got to have both of that, which relates to the question that Bruno asked earlier on, which is to do with sort of freedom and determination and undetermination, which is that both of them are there, because the way I think these things work is that sort of freedom expresses itself through different experiences, different relationships in the past, and through that greater freedom is realized, which is part of the adventure of history. But where I think we need to differ from Hegel is to understand that as long as human beings are human, and as long as human beings interact with each other and with nature, there is more freedom to be realized. In other words, we don't arrive at a moment in time, where we're entirely free from necessity. And I think the reason for that, this is something that isn't spelled out in the literature, is that the relationship between freedom and necessity itself is also contingent. And necessity isn't just simply a material, sum of things that, once we've overcome the realm of necessity with the realm of freedom, it goes away. It doesn't really go away, which is why all this contemporary discussion, a lot of anti-consumers talk about basic needs. And we now have our, we now have what we go, well, actually, we don't. Because, what we need is historically kind of contingent. That relation between freedom and necessity, I think, is alive, is forever. As long as there is a human being, that dynamic is going to continue, which is, the really exciting thing about life. I mean, if you ever did come to an end, you would end up with the Fukuyama situation, where you have this boring, sort of pseudo-liberal society, where freedom means nothing, other than the fact that we have some paper rights.
Frank.